tumble dryer starts to get sluggish as it turns, or it makes a screeching sound, it could be the motor bearings are tight or worn, and if left they could stop the motor from turning and eventually burn the windings out, resulting in you needing a new motor. This video is on how to replace the bearings in a Hotpoint tumble dryer motor, and covers both the condenser type of dryer and the vented type, because in most cases they're the same motor apart from the length of the drive shaft. The motor used in this example is from a vented tumble dryer. As you can see, here are two types of bearings that fit these motors, but they're rarely available from domestic appliance stores, so you may have to get them from somewhere that specialises in bearings, or try eBay. The tools needed for this task are a hammer, a 6 to 8 inch length of 1/2 inch, or if you prefer 15mm copper piping, a T15 Torx bit, a T25 Torx bit, or a 7mm socket and drive, a driver attachment for the Torx bits, a bearing puller, minimum length 4 inches or 6 inches depending on the motor you're working on. This is essential, and if you don't have one, then buy one rather than try to do the job without. A set of pullers, 3 inch, 4 inch and 6 inch, will only cost about £12, plus the bearings about £8, against the cost of a new motor, which would be between £60 and £80. You'll also need a spanner for the bearing puller and a multimeter. I'm starting with the motor out of the machine because we already have 2 videos on how to change a motor in a tumble dryer in our collection on YouTube, which cover vented and condensing dryers. So if you're not sure how to access the motor, use one of the links available at the end of this video. First, remove the fan mounting. You could just knock it off, but as you have the right tool, then pull it off. This will prevent it from getting bent or damaged. Using a T25 Torx bit or a 7mm socket, undo the 3 screws holding the motor to the support frame, but first make a note of which way round the motor fits in it. The end with the 2 screws fit the belt end of the motor, which is also the end where the wires exit the motor casing. You're not in a race, so it's better if you make a note of where parts fit and which way round they go, rather than just seeing how fast you can take it apart with no regards on how it all goes back together again. Replace the T25 Torx bit with a T15 Torx bit and undo the screws around the motor casing. This may seem a bit obvious, but it's probably a good idea if you're doing a job indoors to cover the worktop first with a heavy toweling to prevent scratching it. Lightly tap the pulley end of the drive shaft with your hammer, and this will push the opposite end of the motor casing off and allow for the rotor to be removed. The reason I say tap the pulley end of the shaft is if you tap the other end, it will free the part of the casing that the wires exit, and they may get pulled as it comes off. Plus, it's a bit more involved regarding lining up the wires when it comes to replacing this end. On either end of the rotor shaft is a spring-type washer that sits between the bearing and the motor casing. Remove these and keep them safe somewhere, because they need to go back when the motor is reassembled, and they do not come with the new bearings, so don't lose them. Before you fit the bearing extractor, you may want to smear the shaft with a little grease or spray it with WD-40, just to reduce the friction as the old bearing is pulled off. Bearings become defective for a number of reasons, and any one of them could have contributed to the failure of your ones. With tumble dryers, the most common cause is dust getting in the casing and drying out the grease. There's no way to completely eliminate this problem, but it helps if the filters are cleaned regularly. Behind the bearing is a spacing sleeve that sits between it and the rotor. This must be replaced before the new bearing to ensure it's located in exactly the correct position on the shaft. If you never lubricated the shaft when you removed the old bearings, you may want to lightly grease it now or spray it with WD-40, but don't put too much grease on, just enough to take the dryness off the shaft. Put the bearing on as far as it will go, then stand it upright on a wooden base. Then fit the copper pipe over the shaft so that it rests on the inner ring of the bearing. The end of the pipe should be straight so it rests flat on the bearing, allowing it to be forced down evenly. Follow the same procedure and fit the second bearing. When they've both been replaced, fit the spring washers before inserting the rotor into the casing. When you put the second part of the casing on, just make sure the holes line up and you have one small hole opposite a large hole, because the screws are alternate and facing opposite directions. Do the screws up tight, but don't over tighten. The ridges on the motor shaft that accommodate the belt should protrude from the motor the same side as the wires, and there shouldn't be any up or down movement of the shaft. The fan mounting sits on the other end of the motor shaft and has to be tapped on. As with the bearings, it's better to stand the motor on end to do this. When the shaft is level with this part of the mounting, it's on far enough. When you replace the motor in the frame assembly, make sure the end of the motor which the belt goes on is at the end with the two screw holes in, and the wires are on the right hand side as you look at it, or you'll find they won't reach the capacitor when it's refitted to the machine. Just to be on the safe side, check you've not trapped any wires between the casing. It only takes a minute and could save a lot of aggravation later. This simple test will only show up a direct short. Touch one of your meter probes on the casing of the motor and the other on each of the three wires separately. If you get a reading from any of the connections, you have a short circuit and the motor needs further investigation. On behalf of Selfix UK, we'd like to thank you for watching this video and hope you found it useful. Goodbye.